Well, let me kick it off. I'm Noah Rosenfarb. For those of you that don't know me, I'm one of the founders of Wealthrive. And today we've got our Thrive Talk, which is our way to dive into topics to help you become rich beyond money. And today we're going to be focused on Ray Dalio and what Jenna learned in her time there. Uh, you know, Bridgewater is known for an incredible culture that's quite unique. And so we thought it would be helpful for you to hear what Jenna learned there and hopefully apply it to your business, to your workplace, to your interactions, even potentially at home. Our Thrive Talks are part of our Wealthrive community where entrepreneurs gather to learn and grow. And hopefully this talk will do just that for you. So Jenna, welcome. Excited to have you share this topic with us today. Before we get started and before I have you introduce yourself, for those of you that are here, if you had an interest in learning how to slash your tax bill, I've got a recent ebook that we just published for 7 ways to reduce your taxes. And there's a QR code that you'll be able to scan in just a moment when the slide is put up so that you can download that book if you have an interest in learning some tax strategies. That's one of the areas of focus here at Wealthrive. See if we could get that that slide up. That would be helpful. And maybe post it in the chat. We'll have a link to that ebook as well if you don't want to scan the QR code there. There's a link right in the chat that you could click on and download 7 strategies every entrepreneur needs to know about slashing your tax bill. Now, that doesn't give away all of our best stuff, but hopefully it'll be helpful to some of you. So Jenna, maybe if you don't mind, share a little bit about your background before we touch on your time at Bridgewater.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Appreciate it. So I grew up a competitive figure skater of all things, which is always, people are like, oh, I love watching figure skating, but I've actually never met a figure skater. So to all of you, I am your first figure skater friend. But grew up a competitive figure skater. That was my entire life, 7 days a week, 5 hours every day. And I think the reason why that's such a critical element of my story is because it just taught me so many things about how to, work through things like feedback, how to fall and continue getting up. And so I think that's a major part of my life was my career in skating. And then I joined the Chamber of Commerce. I was there in New Haven, grew up in Connecticut, and I was there for 3.5 years. Chamber of Commerce is such an incredible organization. Got a chance to surround myself and be in the room with some incredible executives and entrepreneurs. And then from there, I took a very strange leap to Bridgewater Associates, having very little knowledge of really how hedge funds really work, but took a giant leap, and I read about the culture and I was like, this sounds absolutely bonkers. Let's give this a whirl. And I was there for 3 years, and then COVID hit, and that presented some new opportunities for me to look elsewhere for additional opportunities. I felt like I had squeezed a lot of the juice out of the Bridgewater lemon, and I was looking for additional opportunities to learn and challenge myself. And I got an opportunity to work at Goldman Sachs, also in Connecticut. And then not that much longer later, I got in touch with you, Noah, through Entrepreneurs Organization, and my husband, who's an entrepreneur and part of EO. And I turned to you and I was like, hey, I know you're not looking to hire, but I think I'm going to be the best hire you ever make, and we should do this. And so I've been working with you and had the pleasure of working with you and Peter Culver for the last 4 years. I'm hard to believe I'm coming up on 4 years here. So I also live in Puerto Rico, which is also something unique. Talk about taxes. Anybody who is interested in taking a weird life turn to live in a Caribbean island, there's some incredible benefits tax-wise for moving here, which is something that we're taking advantage of. So excited to be here and share a little bit about what I've learned during my 3 years at Bridgewater.
Great. Thanks, Jenna. And it has been a great 4 years. Thanks for all your contributions. And, today we'll be able to integrate some of what you learned at Bridgewater to how you've applied it here at Wealthrive and Freedom Family Office. So Bridgewater, for those of you that don't know, is an incredibly large hedge fund Only 1 in 300 people have the opportunity to make it at Bridgewater from the application process to the hiring process. And then only 30% of people end up surviving their first year. So with that in mind, Jenna, maybe you could share a little bit about, what were your expectations when you joined Bridgewater, and what were, some of the things that you heard about the culture going in?
So what's interesting is knowing that I was going to be sharing my story a little bit here, I decided to kind of relive all of those conversations and moments. And I resurrected a whole bunch of email chains and conversations and just kind of sat with them. And I'm like, I don't know what I was thinking. The very first phone screen that I had with a recruiter, so the recruiter reached out to me. I had a great conversation. It was pretty casual. And then I get an email from her about a day later with just ripped apart feedback on all the things that I did wrong on that phone interview. And I was like, I don't think I can handle this. Like, this is intense. This is my first phone screen. Well, I was like, you know what? If there's anybody that can handle this, it's going to be me, and I'm going to figure it out. And I ended up, the interviewing process was, I met with 11 different people over the course of 4 months. And I actually just saw something on Instagram where it was like, you were able to select a pope in 2 days. We don't need 4 months of interviews. And I'm like, yeah, that pretty much sums up my interview process. It was really, really, really intense. After in real time, I was getting feedback on things that I should have been saying differently, or positioning differently, or synthesizing differently. So going into it, I had read a whole bunch of things online. If you look up Bridgewater, I mean, the stories on there are pretty phenomenal, in all ways, great and good, bad, and ugly. And so going in, I knew right after the phone screen, it was going to be an intense process. And it lived up to those expectations. And I would say when I got accepted, I was, pretty surprised, given I received nothing but negative feedback throughout the whole process. I'm like, I wouldn't even hire me after hearing all of this feedback. What is this? But I was able to persevere through all of that. And I'm so glad I did, because the second I was welcomed through those doors at Bridgewater, we get put into a cohort. And the first 3 to 4 weeks for everyone, it doesn't matter if they were to have an interim CEO, they go through what's called boot camp. 3 to 4 weeks of just intense culture training, where you don't even touch your desk. You don't even get to meet your team, pretty much, by and large. You are just put in the room with all the people who else had gotten hired at that time. And they have a new cohort every 2 weeks. And it's just intense culture training, where you read the entire book, this massive book. It was given to us on an iPad, and you go through exercises. And like I said, it's a very, very intense week. I know in my cohort, I want to say at least 2 people had dropped out even before we actually finished boot camp. So it's just intense. So that was kind of my experience jumping in. But it was a wild journey. I'm glad I persevered and kept going with it, because it's been great.
Amazing. And, once you were there and you learned about this culture of what is referred to as radical transparency, what would you say were some of the things that you learned about what does it really mean to have radical transparency, and when is it good, and how can you take the best parts of it and integrate it into another workplace?
So radical transparency, I really didn't have a concept of what that meant before going into Bridgewater. I just assumed like, oh, it just means that we're open and honest with everyone. But they take it to such a different level. When radical transparency, in the way that it's applied every day there, is that you're constantly exposed on a human level, but also on a process and decision-making level. And so when someone, as an example, if someone were to make a decision around anything, literally every single thing that you do was diagnosed to a granular level around your thinking process, what we call mental maps. And the transparency element was that everyone has the ability to listen in to various conversations, just as many of people don't know that every conversation is recorded. There are cameras through the entire campus, everywhere. Every single corner is being recorded, sound and visual recordings. And so if someone were to ask to probe into a question of how a conversation had been held, you can just pull up the recording in basically a bank, a library, an online library of all the recordings, and you can listen in to these conversations shortly after they are having been, held. So it's an area where, there is no hiding your decision-making process. There is no hiding who you are. There's no hiding how you think. It is just like, almost, it feels like you're walking around that building completely naked the whole time, and completely exposed. So it just takes transparency to such a different level than anything I had ever experienced before.
What would you say is the best outcome and maybe the worst outcome of that?
So the best outcome is that it's an idea of meritocracy. So if you have an opportunity to, let's just say, COVID hit while I was at Bridgewater, and there were decisions. So there's 7 campuses that Bridgewater has. Most people know the headquarters in Glendenning and Westport, but there are 7 campuses, and there was a decision around how to navigate COVID and the shutdown. And just as an example, right? Closing some campuses or dropping down to some sort of like critical staffing mechanism, that was that decision-making process was held by leadership teams, and we all had transparency into exactly why that was like every decision was made. People are synthesizing constantly, like, hey, we've decided to shut down this one campus. Here's all the logic. And it's like written in a very extensive email of every part of the decision-making process and the analysis that went into that decision. And that's circulated to everybody impacted. So you're not sitting there being like, oh, I just got a notification that I can't go into work today. I have to work from home, which was also a strange concept. I mean, it's hard to believe that's a strange concept now that we're post-COVID, but it was a strange concept. And so when people received, it's not like a situation where you receive an email where everyone has to stay at home. It's like you have to stay at home and hear all the people that went into deciding this and what the logic was in deciding what campuses were staying open and why, and who's going to be on campus and why. It's just a very transparent way. So I personally love that because it gave me insights into how some of the most brilliant minds were thinking about decisions. So I'm just using one tactical example, but almost every decision that was made had a certain level of transparency and information that was disseminated to the rest of the firm. And so it gave me
things down.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. 100%. Yeah. And it also caused people who felt, because this whole entire system and culture was built off of feedback, and we're given a tool where we can like give feedback in real time. It's called the dot collector. And so when an email would go out about, let's just say, a closed campus, it gave everyone in the entire company empowered them to give feedback on that decision. And so if one decision could result in thousands of dots that would be given as like, I don't think you thought about it this way, or I feel like this was poorly synthesized, or whatever the case may be, or that's a very lateral decision, thinking decision-making process. And so it not only slowed the decision-making process down because anybody making a decision really needed to think through and triangulate their decision, but then it also caused a lot of like churn when it comes to people giving feedback that were not really believable or really had no, in a typical environment, the CEO makes a decision. Most people don't have the ability to give feedback on that decision. And in this environment, everyone is giving feedback to Ray himself, and he would get swarmed with dots as soon as something major like that would happen. So yeah, it's got some.
So what would
downside.
you say was the main downside?
I think gosh, there's a lot. there's a lot of downsides. It's really hard for a human to go through that type of environment. I think most humans are chemically made up to not want to think about their weaknesses or not want to at least talk about them. And so the downside was that there's a lot of people who I think suffered mentally because of that environment and that culture. But I think the kind of more ugly side of it was that it also gave everyone a voice, which sounds great in concept, but also gave people who really didn't have the best intentions a voice to, and a powerful voice. As an example, if something were to be logged, an issue were to be logged, and it's 4 or higher, that goes up to the department level. Well, in any one case, there would be an issue that would be logged by somebody else who saw something that didn't look like it resulted in the best optimal result. They would log an issue. And in some cases, that issue would go up to the department level and sometimes even the CEO level. So David McCormick and Eileen Murray were the two CEOs that took over Ray's position while I was there. And there were instances where Eileen's team was, spent time diagnosing an issue that was really not a huge issue, but somebody logged it at a 5, and therefore it prompts automatically up to the CEO. And so if you were in that environment and you were a bad actor or had like malintent, you had real power to kind of destroy someone or a process just by way of the culture and the mechanisms in place.
So how did that, balance the emotional components of decision making with the logical components?
There were no emotional decisions being made because you couldn't. The second someone saw any emotion in the decision-making process, you were almost attacked for that. I mean, you were getting swarmed with feedback being like, I feel like this was an emotional decision. I feel like this was not logic based. And then you had to then articulate and go to those people who gave you that feedback and say, this is the logic behind the decision, or this is the logic behind the way I articulated something. And if there was any sort of emotion in the process, it's like immediately you get pretty brutally dotted, if you will. So
it's an interesting contrast to the philosophy and framework that we espouse at Wealthrive about becoming rich beyond money, because so often the beyond money part is the emotional part, because the money we can measure in the logic framework, and we can always say this decision would result in a better financial outcome, but then it may result in a disruption of you achieving your softer, more qualitative goals that you have for your life. And so it's an interesting contrast for me to hear, because I believe that so much of the decision-making that we encourage with our clients is to really lean in on that emotional aspect of what is it that you're trying to accomplish in your life that's non-quantifiable, and how can you move closer to some of those goals using the quantitative side to help you get there faster. So
yeah, it's pretty opposite of of that type of environment for sure. Yeah.
So for the founders that are listening, what would you say should be a takeaway for them on the decision-making process and how they might want to get influenced by what you saw there?
So I think the key takeaway is recognizing that emotions exist, and recognizing that in almost every decision, there's going to be some emotion driving, and trying to compartmentalize that and making sure that that's not the leading force behind the decision. Because we're humans, right? And that's I think one of the challenging components about working at Bridgewater is we almost walked around feeling like we had to be robotic and like non-emotive at all. Couldn't show emotion, couldn't like even experience emotions, couldn't think with emotion, couldn't speak with emotion. And in so many ways that was so great. It was such a great learning experience, but at the same time, it was hard, and it required anybody to be successful in that environment required us to be like, okay, in whatever decision I'm making right now, there's a part of that that's going to be emotional, and you have to like take it, compartmentalize it, put it over there, and make sure that like all of the logic is there to back up the decision. So I think that's probably the key takeaway is recognizing, especially entrepreneurs, right? I'm married to one, and I know that like his businesses are his babies, and he's just like tied to it on an emotional level. But any decision that like business critical decision that he has to make, he has to be able to understand like when his emotions are coming into play, and then recognizing that like, is this a decision I want my emotions to play a role or not, and if not, knowing how to compartmentalize them and put that over there so that the logic is taking force.
Yeah, that's a good framework. I know that conflict was used as a catalyst for growth at Bridgewater, and so conflict was encouraged in a way. What was some of the experiences, again, pros and cons of that culture, and what would you say were some of the things that you would encourage people to consider integrating into their culture?
So what's interesting is conflict has such a negative connotation, but we really highlighted it and we looked at it as thoughtful disagreement. That was our term, right? Most people would say it's conflict. We like to think of it as thoughtful disagreement. That was our way of kind of putting a nice spin on it. But every time I got into a disagreement, a thoughtful disagreement with someone, every time, and I could pretty confidently say that this is true, whatever outcome came from that was a better outcome than if we didn't have that conflict and that thoughtful disagreement. Because either, let's just say there are two people kind of deciding, making a decision, they're kind of, they've got two different viewpoints. At the end of that thoughtful discussion, at the end of that conversation around conflict, the outcome is always that someone is more educated, someone has now like learned more about other people's perspectives, and the outcome again is always better. And so I find that I think businesses could be far more productive if they leaned into conflict. And I don't mean conflict as in like getting into fistfights. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like adults having conversations, logic-based conversations, recognizing that emotions might come into play, recognizing that, taking a moment and pause and saying like, hey, I think emotions are coming into play. Let's take them, let's put them over there. We understand that this is emotional decision, emotional discussion, but like in every situation, if we as business owners or we as participants in a business are constantly encouraged to have that conflict, then I do believe that always leads to better outcomes, even if they're challenging. And part of the triangle that we would be like radical truth, radical transparency, meaningful relationships. I'm telling you, like some of those relationships that I had with those people are on a totally different level than I have with even my best friends, because we were constantly encouraged to thoughtfully disagree. So that's probably, I think, the thing that I feel like could make the world a better place and businesses better if we looked at it less like a negative conflict and more of like a thoughtful disagreement.
Yeah, and in EO and YPO, which are two organizations that I'm proud to be a part of and have really influenced me, we have what we call like the top 5% and the bottom 5%, and sharing that level, openly, honestly with your peer group, creates a totally different dynamic and circle of trust and all these other things. So I could imagine how those two get integrated with one another. And one of the things that you brought this year, Jenna, to our strategic planning retreat was an exercise where everybody had shared their lifelines. And I thought that was a great way to infuse like who we are as people at home into our business and getting us to know each other on a deeper level. So I know you got a chance to know Ray Dalio a little bit directly. And so what were some of those interactions like, and what's it like to work with, I don't know if he's the most successful hedge fund manager in the world, but he's got to be, if not number one, in the top five.
Yeah, I mean, it is the largest hedge fund in the world. So he's definitely up there. So Ray has a lot of unique quirks. And I think that's probably the case with all extremely brilliant people. But he was very open about, so I think one of the exciting, so let me take you back into my boot camp days. So it's my week 2, I want to say, of being there. And we're just getting used to the system. We're given an iPad where you have to dot people. So you find people. And when I mean dot people, every single conversation that you have at Bridgewater, you're giving and receiving feedback from. So let's just say you and I have this conversation after this Thrive talk. Not only would we give each other feedback, and you give at least about 3 dots on average, and a third of them have to be negative, like critical feedbacks on things that we feel like we could have done differently and better. But also all the audience members would be given the same iPad and given the opportunity to give us feedback. And they would also be encouraged to give us a third of critical feedback. And so sitting there in boot camp, I've got my 8 other cohort members, and we're given this iPad, and we were just told as we walk in, hey guys, guess what? Ray Dalio has a TED talk coming up, and he wants to practice it in front of you guys, cohort. And you guys are going to have to give the opportunity, or have the opportunity to give feedback. And I'm like, this is strange. This whole place is strange. First of all, I'm going to be meeting Ray Dalio, and I'm a nobody at that point. And then I'm going to have to be giving him feedback, like critical feedback. How can I do that? This guy's brilliant. Well, sure enough, he came in and he gave us the talk. He practiced it just like he would on the TED stage. And there we were, and they're like, okay, guys, let's put this in real time, give him feedback. And here I am, like, giving feedback on how Ray could have done better in his TED talk. And I'm like, this is so strange. But you know what? Then you click on his profile on the iPad and you see that he has tons of feedback. Because like I said, every major decision that comes from the top down, people are giving it empowers the entire, I think we were like 1,200 to 1,500 people, the power to give feedback. And over time, that feedback paints a picture. So I knew in week 2 of meeting him that he was incredibly poor at detailed and organized. That was a specific dot. And his detailed and organized dots were incredibly terrible. And sure enough, they were, right? He was the type of guy that had a whole staff around him, rightfully so. He earned it, to guardrail him from his own weaknesses. And so that's all the way from, he would walk in to the reception area, he would put his bag down, and he would walk away. Now, that bag has some of the most confidential, important documents to ever exist, and yet he puts it down and walks away, because it's just, his mind is so occupied by bigger things that where his bag is not of importance to him. And so we had security teams around him and his administrative team, who were phenomenal people, just there to follow him and pick up where he dropped his glasses and where it's just, his brain just doesn't think about those things. But he was always incredibly generous with his time. Anytime someone would come up to him at one of the events, he would always come to all of our events, our big parties and whatnot. We worked hard, but we also played hard at Bridgewater. We had some pretty incredible parties, and he would always be there. And anybody who wanted to, it didn't matter who you were, you walk up to him and he's genuinely interested in, what do you do for the company? What do you do for the firm? Talk to me about what your experience is. What challenges are you facing? I mean, he was just generous with his we were all drinking his Kool-Aid, and I think he wanted everyone to feel like, we all called each other family. I mean, he wanted to really feel like they were part of the family and part of the bigger picture, and the way that he's trying to change the world. So he's an incredible human, very absent-minded, very forgetful, with things that are not as he deems important, but very generous and I think fairly open-minded. He preached open-mindedness to everyone at the firm, and I think there are some times where we felt like maybe he could be a little bit more open-minded, but he deserves it. He deserves to be a little close-minded.
What was the biggest mindset shift for you, kind of observing him and watching him in that environment, as well as the culture that he built?
So what's interesting is part of boot camp is you're watching videos of the principles in real time. And so you're getting exposure, like the camera would be set up in a big room, and it's usually kind of investment related that they would be kind of diagnosing with Ray in the room. And there were often times where like his principles, his many principles would lay out kind of the ideal way of being with one another as it relates to the culture, where he himself like lacked the ability to uphold the culture himself. And he would be given feedback on that. Like, hey, I watched this video about these principles and we felt like you failed to uphold your own principles. And I think he probably knew that. I mean, there's like, I want to say, I don't even remember because there've been a bunch added since I started, something like 300 principles. And so it's impossible for someone to uphold all of them all of the time. But I think that was to a new person that was like, hey, wait a minute, this guy's not even taking into account his own principles. But in reality, I think more than often than he is a good culture carrier. And he also built teams. We had our own culture team that was very extensive, whose responsibility it was to make sure that the culture was being upheld through the tools, through practice, engagements and training. And so I think there were times where he slipped, but he's a pretty good culture carrier himself.
So they say culture eats strategy for breakfast. What do you say to that?
Not if the culture is the strategy. And I think that's what it was, is the reason Bridgewater is so successful is in part that Ray is smart and that he surrounded himself and hired smart people. But I think what really set them apart from all the other incredible firms that hire incredibly smart people is the culture. And that was a strategy. And I think clients really valued that culture because as we were transparent with one another, we were transparent with clients in a way that was abnormal. And so I think in many cases, financial firms and financial institutions are kind of focused about making sure that they look good to their clients. And Bridgewater didn't have that. Bridgewater was very honest, where when they made bad decisions, it was very honest and oftentimes incredibly transparent to the clients. And I think so therefore it is culture was the strategy, and it's really what developed, I think, set Bridgewater apart from all the other firms that hire great people.
Say during my career, really culture started to become more popularized as something that business owners should pay attention to and go beyond mission, vision, and values. And what would you say in terms of culture and getting it right? What should founders, what should entrepreneurs, what should people that are executives, how should they be thinking about culture beyond the buzzwords and the headlines?
So I think identifying what culture you want is key. I think we think of culture in especially small to mid-sized businesses as the culture is we are a family and we all get along and we're honest with each other. We give feedback. We work together. We're collaborative. Okay, that's not a culture. That's a basics. But identifying what culture do you want in your company, and then how do you make sure that every day you are a culture carrier yourself as a business owner? And is it a culture of feedback? This was radical truth, radical transparency. That doesn't work for everyone. Maybe the culture is, there was someone I was just speaking with this morning that said her whole culture is about giving, showing appreciation and calling people out, rewarding people, and in like public appreciation. That's a culture, but making sure that you identify what the culture is, what the culture that you want to have, and making sure that you have mechanisms in place so that everyone is on the same bus. I think it's a little bit of like the drinking the Kool-Aid. I know people have attributed Bridgewater culture to a cult. And there are some aspects where it could feel like that, but as soon as you are bought in to whatever culture that is, as an employee of Bridgewater, and it was a crazy culture, right? It was very different. It was abnormal. As soon as I decided like, oh yeah, this is where I want to be, now I'm on a train going in the same direction as everyone else. And if you're not on that train, you're out. You're not going to make it. You're not going to survive, as we would say. And so I think if for business owners, identifying what culture do you want to have, what culture feels right from an integrity standpoint, and then what mechanisms and teams in place can you put to make sure that everyone is bought into that culture? Because once you buy into that culture, you will now have an army of people who will go to bat for you, and do everything they can to make that successful because they're bought in. They've drank the Kool-Aid. And I think that, again, there's so much negative connotation to some of the terms I'm talking about, but I witnessed firsthand on how empowering and like motivating that was.
What routines and rituals would you say help to integrate that culture and maintain it?
I mean, we had physical tools that we could use to uphold a culture. That's through the dot collector. That was through a principals app, right? Every single employee of the entire company read his entire book. So like there are some tactical things that we could do, but I think because you're bought into that kind of Kool-Aid, because you're bought into that culture, now you have a team again who will go to bat for you, who will want to carry that culture forward, but also more importantly, hold everyone else accountable to that culture. And so when we found that there were people who are acting outside of our culture norms at Bridgewater, that was called out transparently through a very open dialogue of like, hey, I don't think you're acting in good faith of the culture. And it was told to us like, eat, sleep, kind of really embrace the culture. And so if for anyone that we would engage with across the entire company, if we saw someone that was not acting in good faith of the culture, we called it out. We dotted them. We said like, hey, your conversation this morning was completely against our culture. Or, one thing that didn't happen at Bridgewater is talking behind people's backs. My goodness, if you did that, like everyone would be like, pause. Have you said these words to this other human that you're talking about? And if the answer was no, they were like dotted. It was an issue. It was diagnosed. It was a serious issue. Because you were not allowed to talk about people behind people's backs. And everyone was bought into that. And so the people who like did that thing, when you ask about like how can someone kind of uphold the culture throughout, have people like your culture carriers across the team and have people hold each other accountable to living that whatever culture you've decided you want.
Yeah. How would you say you've brought that into Wealthrive and Freedom Family Office? Maybe talk about the fundamentals or.
Yeah. So we do have a not only core values, but fundamentals. And we talk about them on a weekly basis. And not only did we've done it a couple of different ways, but we identified through, the name is going to slip my mind, culture.
Culture-wise.
Culture-wise, yes, thank you. Through culture-wise, we were able to identify the 28 fundamentals that like meant something to us as leaders of the company. And we talk about them on a weekly basis. So we have a weekly huddle with our entire team. And every week we discuss one of those fundamentals. We've gone through this process, I think probably 6 times now. And yet we still do it because we need to remind ourselves of like, these are the things that we should be holding each other and ourselves accountable to doing. So they're on our website. I welcome anybody to go onto our website and check them out, the fundamentals that we have. We like to include them in some of our client engagements, sharing with clients transparently what our fundamentals are. If there's a client case where we went above and beyond for some strange reason outside of hours and we hunted people down for our clients, which we have done. Absolutely. Ask Peter. We've got some great stories on that. That's our way of our opportunity as a team to say like, hey, Peter, for a client, he found a way. And that's one of our fundamentals. And he did everything he could to make sure he found a way for this client. And so it's not only something that we talk about on a weekly basis, but we do kind of highlight, call people out in a good way to the rest of the team when other people are upholding the fundamentals. So yeah, we found like that's really been our they're not quite as extensive as the massive book of principles, but they are our fundamentals that really keep us motivated and aligned as a team.
And I noticed Samir had put some of them in the chat just for those of you listening to get a glimpse of how we've integrated some of this thinking into our workplace. And, Jen, I think it'd be helpful maybe to tie your Bridgewater thinking to what it is that we do at Wealthrive and how we engage with entrepreneurs with the way that you're building our systems and processes to help our clients become rich beyond money. What are some of the ways that you could connect the dots between your experience there and your leadership within our firm?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that I actually do encourage everyone to read the principles. I know it's a really big book, but they really do he goes through every single principle and kind of, in an extent, something that's like he'll share how it's applied. And so encourage people to read the principles. I think it's going to be pretty powerful to anybody who is interested in it. But there's a lot that I've taken from this experience and applied to Wealthrive, not only for clients, but also for us operationally and internally. A big element is transparency, right? Holding each other accountable. Those are things that we do internally and on an operational level, but also with the clients. Like if we make a mistake, we're not hiding that. We're transparently saying, hi, we made a mistake. We messed up. This is how we're addressing it. And this is how we're looping from the mistake. This is what we've learned from our mistakes. Also closed-mindedness and open-mindedness, that balance. Like we know when we need to bring in other experts for triangulation. If a client asks us a question and we feel like maybe that's outside the scope of our deep expertise, we will go find someone who is smarter than we are in that area. And we have no shame in doing that. We have no shame, and we're transparent about the fact that we rely on other people and experts to make sure that our the questions are being answered and they're cared for. So I think there's a lot when it comes to what I've taken from that and applied to not only the client experience, but also internally and operationally. But I think that the finding a way, the balance between open-mindedness and closed-mindedness, the balance of assertiveness and open-mindedness, transparency are key elements that we have really brought over from Bridgewater into Wealthrive.
So you've been, incredibly successful in every workplace that you've entered, and, so happy to have you here. What would you say are some of the things that, rituals or habits that you would say have made a big difference in your ability to be successful in the workplace?
I would say understanding myself is probably the biggest, I would say, piece of leverage that I have. So at Bridgewater, we took every single personality exam or test or quiz under the sun. In fact, I resurrected one from like my last week there that I ended up having printed out and I took with me, where like every single element, and this is pages and pages and pages and pages long, where I like scored on each thing. Surprisingly, one of the surprising elements was the fact that I apparently am not humorous. I always thought I was, but no, that was actually like really scored quite low there. But understanding what makes me tick, understanding what my strengths and weaknesses are, and then being upfront about that, and relying on other people who are strong where I am weak, and looking at this, like literally looking at this objectively. I am not perfect. I have tons of weaknesses. And this is where I rely on people like Judy and Keisha and Dan and Kyle and Peter and everyone on the team to kind of fill in where I am not great. And I say that, right? Like, I'm like, hey, ask anyone on the team. How many times am I like, I might not be thinking about this right in the right way. Like help kind of probe my thinking. Because I know that I'm not perfect, but I do know that if I am surrounded by people who are strong where I am weak, then I can be unstoppable. And I think that's where, if I didn't have the honest viewpoint of what my weaknesses are, I would be approaching my own ceiling. But because I know where I'm weak, which everyone has weaknesses. And when I say that, most people are like, oh yeah, of course I have weaknesses. Duh, I work too hard. Or, those aren't weaknesses. We're not talking about those. We're talking about really painful, honest weaknesses about ourselves. And if you know how to surround yourself with people that are strong where you are weak, then you will be unstoppable.
That's great advice. I think one of the books that I love that talks about the pairing of the visionary entrepreneur with the kind of more process-oriented integrator is Rocket Fuel. And I think that that's what's really been helpful to the triumvirate of you and Peter and myself as co-founders of Wealthrive, is not just that we can balance each other's strengths and weaknesses, but from an operational standpoint, we also have different strengths and weaknesses in addition to our personality, our technical skills. And so I would double down on what you said there about knowing how to fill the gaps with the people around you to help you, become more successful and stronger together. I know we're going to flash up another thing on the screen here with next month's Thrive Talk. We're going to be talking about taxes. So for those of you that are making quarterly estimated tax payments, if you want to figure out how to reduce those quarterly estimates, next month, Wednesday, June 18th at 5:30, we'll be addressing that. Your quarterly estimates, I believe, are due the day before. And so I think it might be top of mind for you if you're looking for more ways to reduce your overall income tax exposure. Hopefully you'll join us there if you scan that QR code, or if you go into the chat, we'll post a link where you could sign up for that event as well. And before I open it up for any questions that we have, and again, please feel free to post them in the chat. Jenna, maybe a final question. If Ray himself were listening to this talk, what would you want him to know about the impact that he's had on your life and your career?
I mean, I really have a hard time putting into words any sort of answer to that, because like he has literally changed everything for me. And I know that sounds so wild and out of this world, but it's really true. He's hit that culture, and working there has changed how I see myself. It's changed how I see others. It's changed how I think, how I articulate my logic, how I operate with one another, with myself. It really has changed everything for me, which I think every opportunity that every work environment, or even not working social environment, changes you in some way. But, similar to how I appreciate my skating career, and I attribute a lot of like my core values to that type of training. I think Bridgewater equally did that in 3 years. And, my skating career was 15 years and Bridgewater summed that up in 3 years. But I learned more about myself than I think I probably ever will. And I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity. Like, why would they even hire me? Like, and I was ripped apart in the interview process. But not only did they hire me, but I ended up thriving there. And I'm like, I can't even articulate how grateful I am for that experience. It was really incredible. I wish everyone could experience it, even though it's really painful.
I know you developed a handout that you are willing to share with not only the people that are listening live, but people that listen to the recording. Can you talk a little bit about what's contained there? What's some of the value that they'll get in that download that they'll be able to receive?
Yeah, so there's a couple of principles that are kind of applicable to business owners, but then also really how we as Wealthrive kind of think about those principles and apply those principles to the client experience that we have for any of our clients that we work with. So yeah, I hope everyone sees some value not only of this conversation, but that handout. And I'm an open book. I would welcome any questions, even if not today, but afterwards, on what it was like to work there and really how to apply any of those principles into your business operations or your client experience. I'm happy to lend some time to anyone who wants it.
Terrific. Thank you, Jenna. If anyone has any questions, feel free to either come off mute, raise your hand, type it in the chat, and happy to answer them for you. And while we wait for that, maybe Jenna, is there anything else that I didn't ask that you'd like to be sure to share with the audience today?
I would say that it was a really challenging. I'm speaking about my experience as in it was all great. There were a lot of moments where it was really hard, and being honest about what your weaknesses are objectively, by the way. So it's not what we think our weaknesses are, it's what other people think our weaknesses are. That's really hard to admit, and really hard to accept. And when somebody tells you poorly synthesized something when you simply responded to a question, and like you get ripped apart for a poor synthesis, it really second guesses like everything you knew about yourself. And it was challenging. Like, I have to be honest, it was a really, really hard environment to work in. That said, as it says, the statistic is 30% don't survive the first year. There's a reason that is the case, and it's usually not because they were fired. It's usually self-selected. I can't take this. So that's the kind of ugly part of it. But if you're especially as an athlete, if you have any sort of athletic mindset, which is, I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who was an athlete, but if you're an athlete and you go to your coach and all they do is tell you what you did great, they're a terrible coach, right? You want to be told exactly what you were doing wrong. So I think that's why like athletes kind of thrive in that environment. But it's definitely not an easy environment. And I want to make sure like I said all the great things about it, but I want everyone to know how hard it was, and how if you meet anyone who's been at Bridgewater for more than a year, just be like, hats off to you. You did it.
Terrific. Samir, I see your hand is raised. If you want to come off mute. Oh, can't unmute.
Oh.
Let's see. Maybe I can hear.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Now we hear you.
So one question for you, Jenna, and I encourage anyone else listening in, because we do these every month, to raise your hand and jump in. It'd be awesome. Jenna has a lot of value. But my question is around one of my favorite principles from Ray Dalio that I have on my wall is pain plus reflection equals progress. And I'd be curious from your perspective how you use that in your day-to-day and how it's kind of helped your life. Like, I just think that's such a powerful one. And I think sometimes we look at the pain of like, not closing deals or, losing a business or whatever it is as a negative, but that framework helped me understand the beauty of like the pain, because then you can make progress.
That is a good topic. So, in every instance, so not only like the tactical losses, but also receiving feedback is, like I said, incredibly painful. And the initial reaction, if you give someone feedback, is they will typically defend whatever you're giving feedback on. And then they will say, but I'm totally open-minded and I will think about that and I'll take that in and like internalize that. Well, you're not allowed to react when you receive feedback at Bridgewater. In fact, if you do that, then you'll just get completely slammed for an emotional reaction, because it is an emotional reaction. There's a reason why it's called an emotional reaction. There's no logical reaction, right? When you feel that pain. And so recognizing anytime you're experiencing pain, that you will, as a human, want to jump in and like fight or flight. But if you just pause and just be like, I'm not going to do that thing. I want to do that thing. I'm not going to do that thing. I'm going to sit and I'm just going to sit here. And oftentimes a lot of team members, there's a reason why the campuses are beautiful and they're like in the middle of the woods. It's because a lot of people who experience the pain of Bridgewater have to go for a walk, sit on a picnic table and just like sit in it. And then you're able to think through it in a much more like healthier way than getting defensive. So that pain plus the reflection is really key, because that's ultimately what gets you to loop. I don't know if that answered your question.
Asked a great question in the chat around this feedback loop. And is there any believability weighting or credibility weighting to it? He gave a great analogy. You know, if he's shooting free throws and an NBA All-Star is critiquing him, that's very different than, you know, a 13-year-old.
Yeah. So great question. And the answer is yes. So part of the mechanisms of the DOTS collector, which is the software that we used, which I think when I left there, it was just being rolled out to be, you know, used across multiple businesses. It was just an internal tool, but part of that is believability weighted, I would say like feedback, where you can see if I've been dotted as an example. So if I've been dotted threes, which is really bad, a 3 is not great. It's out of 10. If I were dotted 3 on synthesis over and over and over and over again by people who are really believable in synthesis, the system will calculate that, and it's brilliant. It's a really complex system. Will calculate that, and so that I become believable in being terrible at synthesis. So if I give now someone a dot in synthesis, that will hold more weight because everyone else agrees that I'm bad at it. So it's a very complex kind of technical system that really does calculate that believability weighted kind of feedback into it. Because you're exactly right. Like, but if you have, I'm Shaquille O'Neal giving you 1 ounce of feedback on your free throw, then that's going to have a lot of weight, because everyone will agree in the company that Shaquille O'Neal is phenomenal at free throws, right? Actually, don't know if he is. I assume he is. But point being is, if everyone else continues to give you feedback on certain elements of whatever the characteristic is, then your believability goes up. And now every dot you give, it weighs more on their scorecard.
Very cool. We'll go with one last question. I know we're right at the top of the hour here. Thresha asked, what helped you ease into adapting to and eventually embodying the culture that you were being taught, and especially the aspects that were completely new to you or the parts that you really had trouble resonating with?
That's a really good question. And I think I innately had an upper hand in going into the culture because I was an athlete. So I'll say that I came from an environment where I was constantly told the things I need to be doing better. You know, I would do a clean program, what I thought was amazing, and I'd go to the coach, and my coach would tear me apart. That's what the environment I grew up in. So I definitely had the upper hand going into it. But I think what was a challenge was how in real time it was. So as an example, I led a very large team. I think at one point I had 18 people on my team. I would go into a presentation And I have my iPad right in front of me with the dot collector right in front of me. And as I'm speaking, giving whatever talk I am, I'm getting real-time feedback. And on my screen right in front of me, I'm seeing all the red dots because they're color coded. If it's high dot, you get green. If it's low, it's red. And I'm seeing all that come in real time. That was really challenging because usually you get feedback after you're done with the thing. But as it was coming in real time, knowing how to accept that and recognize that like my internal emotions are like already like, spinning, and continuing to like suppress that so that I can continue with like whatever track I'm on. That was, I think, the biggest challenge I had.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jenna, for sharing your experience and synthesizing it for us in a way that we could digest it in an hour. Thanks to those of you who are here live on the call. We're going to be sending this recording out to the others that couldn't make it. And I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from the Evernote CEO, who says there's a difference between a difficult decision and an uncomfortable decision. And often what we find is that, too frequently, the difficult thing is where we don't know the solution. The uncomfortable thing is where we know exactly what the solution is, but we're just too fearful to have that conversation with someone. And I think Ray Dalio has done an amazing job of reading into his team that the uncomfortable thing is going to be said, and it's going to be said quickly, and only the difficult is what's going to require time and attention. So
Totally.
Thanks again, everybody. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Hope to see you next month if you want to lower your estimated tax payments. We'll see you then.